The man himself, where it all started, the guy who invented fascism, Benito Mussolini. That's who I'm going to be talking about today in a video series called See You in Hell, where I celebrate the deaths of right-wing figures in history, and there basically isn't a bigger one. He's definitely up there in terms of terrible fascist idiots, and here he is, Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini was born to Alessandro and Rosa Mussolini. Rosa, his mother, was a Catholic schoolteacher, and his father, Alessandro, was from Romagna, which was a very, very radical part of Italy at the time. When his father was born, it was still part of the papal states, like as in the Pope was in charge of the place. This was part of the reason that Alessandro, Mussolini's father, was such a political radical. He was an early sort of socialist agitator, and that is the reason that Benito Mussolini got all of his particularly radical names. Mussolini had three names: Benito, Amilcare, Andrea. Amilcare and Andrea were both names that came from Italian radicals that his father admired. Benito is actually named after Benito Juarez, the indigenous president of Mexico and a fighter against the Habsburg monarchy when it came into Mexico at the behest of the French. So Benito Mussolini had a long history, stretching back even before he was actually born, of being connected to radicalism. And that is something that he continued in his eventual political career. But at first, that didn't really seem like that was where Benito Mussolini was going to go. As a youth, he actually had a reputation as a delinquent, apparently getting into knife fights with children at his school. This eventually changed, however, when he was taken out of the Catholic school in his locality and taken to a different secular school in a different place. There, he actually apparently excelled and did very well, particularly in history courses and Italian literature courses. After graduation, he joined the profession of his mother at 18, becoming a schoolmaster. This position didn't really pay very well, but it did afford him a certain amount of social respectability. However, this social respectability was not enough for the young Mussolini. He wanted to do something with his life, and one of the things that he did not want to do, at least at first, was join the Italian military. At this time, military service was obligatory for Italian men of a certain age, and so to escape this, young Benito moved away. He left Italy and fled north into Switzerland. Benito Mussolini's life in Switzerland began in 1902, where he traveled all around the country, eventually speaking all of the official languages of Switzerland. He already spoke Italian, but he then learned French and also German. He did extremely well for himself in Switzerland and became a well-known figure on the Swiss left. By the late 1900s, right before 1910, Benito Mussolini was returning to Italy, partly in order to actually fulfill his military requirements that he had been fleeing, but also because he was already starting to differ himself, already starting to distance himself from the Italian and Swiss left. He was moving away from people like Karl Marx and towards people like Sorel, a esoteric European thinker who believed in the power of violence and will. These are themes that are going to be coming back when we talk about the origins of fascism as a political ideology. Back in Italy, Mussolini continued his radical political journey, but tempered a little bit by his experiences in Switzerland. He also began to really embody one of the most sort of constant things about his life was that he had a reputation of being kind of a rolling stone. He had a lot of mistresses all over the place, potentially fathered a lot of children, several of them out of wedlock, including ones with people whom he would eventually marry. Mussolini returned to teaching, but then left it in 1909 to be the leader of a socialist organization in a city called Trent, which at the time was not in Italy, but in fact in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, ruled by the Habsburgs, whose enemy, Benito Juarez, he was named after. In the early 1910s, Mussolini's star was rising. He was rising very high in the Socialist Party in Italy, eventually becoming the editor of Avanti, the Socialist Party newspaper in Milan. At this time, right before World War I, he also married a woman, Ida Dressler, who was one of his mistresses and the mother of one of his first children. This marriage lasted only a short period of time. They got it annulled. They sort of divorced after about a year. Eventually, when Mussolini was a dictator, he tried to cover this up, but a couple records survived, and so this is why we know for a fact that they were actually married. Immediately after this, he married his eventual wife, the wife that he would be with for the remainder of his life, a woman named Rachel. This personal life rupture, the end of his marriage with Dressler and the beginning of his marriage with Rachel, coincided with a big world historical rupture, the beginning of World War I. Now, at the beginning of World War I, Italy was neutral, and this was essentially what a lot of the Socialist Party wanted in Italy. The socialists in Europe were extremely divided over World War I. Some of them, the more radical ones, said that they should sit out the war and encourage their countries to do so, that any fight between the bourgeoisie of Europe was ultimately a way to put working people in front of, munitions and chemical weapons and death, and it was not a struggle that the working people should themselves involved in. However, Mussolini disagreed with this. He believed that it was useful, that it was helpful for workers to be involved in their own national political struggles. And this was eventually the position that he pushed inside of the Socialist Party, dividing him from what became the Socialist Party leadership. Eventually, Mussolini's faction, the people who wanted Italy to join the war, won out. And Italy joined the Triple Entente, the forces of Britain, France, and Russia, in fighting Germany, Austria-Hungary, and eventually the Ottoman Empire. During World War I, Mussolini returned to service in the Italian military in 1915. He joined as an enlisted man, although he very quickly rose in the ranks to be a corporal, a non-commissioned officer. He was offered a position in the, essentially the press corps of the Italian military because of his experience working in the Italian socialist press, but he declined. He said that he wanted to work in the trenches and that he wanted to actually talk to soldiers and engage with them. He had this opportunity and did participate in combat on the front lines against the Austrians. In 1917, he and several other service members in his group were severely injured during a test of a gun. Many of them died. Mussolini got away, but with severe injuries in his leg. He was taken to a hospital where he recovered, although that hospital was itself under regular shell fire from the Austrians. So Mussolini was no stranger to the actual horrors of war. The thing is, though, that Mussolini believed that those experiences were ultimately good. Like, he thought that they were good for people to experience. And this became the foundation of fascist politics. Shortly after Mussolini's brush with death, the United States entered the war, and this was ultimately what turned the tide against the Germans and the Austrians. In 1919, Italy was on the winning side in World War I, but it was a nation that was extremely humbled. Many of its people were dead, a lot of its territory was devastated due to fighting with the Austrians, and also Italy was not really going to be given exactly what it wanted in this war. It was not given a lot of the coast on the other side of the Adriatic Sea that it wanted from Austria-Hungary. It was given some Italian-speaker territory in the rest of Austria-Hungary, but it didn't really get everything it wanted. And so Italy, just like Mussolini, had an experience of being through something harrowing, something deadly, something difficult, and not getting exactly what they wanted out of it. This spirit of having the rug pulled out from under them, of being denied what they thought they were owed, is the foundation that eventually made Mussolini coalesce with a bunch of other people who were former radicals but also veterans of World War I to start the fascist group, the first fascist organization. They were called the Fasciai di Combattimento, the fascists of combat. At this point, fascist meant still its original, sort of like originally Roman meaning. It was a reference, a metaphor about a bundle of sticks that were tied around an axe. The idea here was that these sticks together were combined and became something stronger than they were alone. That's the metaphor that fascism was initially trying to capture. People uniting and becoming more powerful together. In the fascist party's case, the fascist party being the organization that Mussolini would eventually make out of this initial sort of like cadre of people, the idea was that they were going to take their experiences in the trench and transform them into a political ideology. The fascist organization did very well, especially once it became a political party. By the late 1910s and the very, very early 1920s, it was growing, but not explosively. It had many, many promises that it made to people that sort of like bridged the gap between the traditional right wing and the new radical left. So the Italian fascists were in favor of the reorganization of the economy, but they opposed socialism and communism. They said that the economy should be reorganized in what they called an organic fashion. What they meant there was basically like that everybody should just get along, and they just thought that that would just basically they just thought that once they took power that would happen, right? And that socialists would stop agitating because they would kill them. The Fascist Party initially also proposed suffrage for women, which was previously illegal in Italy, and they also proposed a number of other, actually kind of pretty serious transformative changes to Italian society. A lot of these changes would eventually be left by the wayside once the fascists eventually took power. But in the early 1920s, none of that seemed to be guaranteed. They were doing pretty well. They had done okay in a couple parliamentary elections. Mussolini ended up in the legislature of Italy, but Italy was still the country that it was, a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy led by King Victor Emmanuel. Eventually, however, other fascist militants, technically not Mussolini himself, decided that enough was enough. They were going to march on Rome and try to take power themselves. This was in keeping with one of the fascists' main tactics, which was a combination of electoral strategy and organizing and using political violence in order to kill or intimidate their opponents. That was exactly what they were going to do. They were saying like, hey, we think that we should be in charge of the country. We have some limited representation in the legislature and some state, local officials, right? We think that we should be able to control the country. And so tens of thousands of fascists marched on Rome to demand that the king appoint Benito Mussolini as the prime minister. The king probably could have sent the army to stop them. The Italian army was massively better equipped than the fascist black shirts, which is what the fascist paramilitaries were called. But the question was, if he sent the army, would they step up or would they support the fascists? Hard to tell. Eventually, the king decided to let them take the city, and the Duce, as Benito Mussolini was called in the fascist party, rode down from Milan. He was not actually part of the March on Rome itself, and he accepted the position of premier, of prime minister, from the king. From this point on, the Italian fascist party was in control in Italy. They consolidated this rule through a series of like stupid parliamentary arrangements and laws, which essentially granted them permanent majority position in the Italian legislature. And thus, the Italian fascist state was born. Technically still the Kingdom of Italy. The king was still the king for the entirety of the fascist period. The success of Mussolini's administration was dependent on this combination of conservative stodginess and radical, extreme right-wing political violence. This combination was ultimately the winning one for him and for fascists in general. They were just stodgy and sort of normal enough that the business elites, the conservatives, weren't really going to turn on them. But they were violent enough that the left itself was extremely hurt and destroyed by their violent actions. The only group that really could have done anything about them was being shot, being killed, being imprisoned. For example, Antonio Gramsci, the leader of the Italian communists and actually Mussolini's successor as the editor of Avanti, was imprisoned by the Italian fascist regime in order to prevent him from leading any kind of resistance against the Italian fascist state. As a political ideology, fascism was a little amorphous. Sometimes it was extremely radical, and sometimes it was pretty standard. Mussolini summed up fascism in his own words several times. He even jokingly said that, his opponents say that we have no doctrine. However, in the Fascist Doctrine, which is a document that he wrote in 1932, Mussolini characterizes fascism as the following. Fascism is a religious conception in which man is seen in his immanent relationship within a superior law and with an objective will. Yikes. What Mussolini means is that fascism is about feeling, it's about power, it's about violence, it's about fervor, it's about like, ugh, right? It's not about manifestos, it's not about policy platforms. This allowed Mussolini to jettison a lot of the claims that he had made when he was leading the fascist party when they were trying to take power. For example, he entirely abandoned the plan to implement female suffrage, saying that people would think that it made him weak for wanting women to vote. At first, the Italian fascist state didn't have the kind of racial discriminatory laws that eventually Nazi Germany would adopt. In fact, many Jewish people were actually members of the Italian Fascist Party, and one of Mussolini's own mistresses was herself Jewish. This would eventually change, but I'll get to that in a second. There wasn't really even an extensive crackdown on the left or progressive or radical wings of the fascist party, unlike in Germany, where the Nazis did that basically day one, as soon as they had outlived their usefulness. Mussolini's state was essentially a less radical, a less violent, a less terrifying version of the German fascist state, but that still makes it pretty terrible. It was a rule by decree state, it was a one-party state. Opposition was not allowed, opposition was not listened to. The only voice that mattered, ultimately, was that of Mussolini and whoever he had listened to most recently. One of the other more complicated relationships that Mussolini had was with Adolf Hitler. By about 10 years into Mussolini's tenure as the leader of Italy, Adolf Hitler became the prime minister, the chancellor of Germany, and implemented and created their Nazi state. Again, similarly, not actually technically destroying the state that they had before, but sort of building their own on top of it. Mussolini had a complicated relationship with Hitler. He was in favor of more fascists taking power, but he was worried about being essentially overshadowed, by a bigger and more powerful and more radical, more violent fascist state. In fact, he actually triangulated against Hitler when Hitler was trying to take over Austria, which was at the time ruled by a third different fascist dictator, a guy named Engelbert Dollfuss. Mussolini even actually said that he would send in Italian troops to protect Austria if Germany tried to invade. Of course, he eventually backed down when it became clear that the Germans were going to outgun them if that were the case, and ultimately did end up finding himself as a sort of little brother, but an older little brother to Adolf Hitler. Fortunately for him, Adolf Hitler actually liked Mussolini and trusted him and was a major support for the Italian Fascist Party throughout World War II. One of the promises Mussolini made as a nascent dictator in fascist Italy was that he would create an Italian empire. He tried to do this in North Africa and also in Ethiopia, but both of these essentially failed. And his, being less successful than the Germans and his relying on German support meant that by 1938, he was essentially a German puppet in all but name. In 1938, he was forced by the Germans to adopt the same kind of racial discrimination laws that the Nazis had had. This eliminated a lot of the protections that Jewish people had experienced in fascist Italy, and even resulted in the kidnappings and deaths and killings of many members of the fascist party who were themselves Jewish. By the time that World War II broke out, Italy was on the side of the Germans. They participated in the invasion of France and did some invasions in Greece and Albania, but none of these did particularly well. They fought against the Allies in North Africa, but again, none of this worked out particularly well for them. Ultimately, Italy became the sort of weak point of the Axis, which the Allies eventually used in order to invade Europe from the south, starting in Sicily and moving their way up the boot of Italy. This soured the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler, and also soured Mussolini's relationship with a lot of Italians. As many people have pointed out, one unexcusable thing that a dictator can do is to lose a war. So as Mussolini was losing World War II, he was losing support in Italy, even within the fascist party. And so, as a result of this loss of support, on July 15th, 1943, Mussolini was brought in to the cabinet, essentially, of Italy by many of the other members of the Italian ruling state and told that the prime ministership was no longer his. He was being removed from office. The king, Victor Emmanuel III, confirmed this, and Mussolini was then taken to prison. He was going to be tried for his crimes of being a dictator, but was ultimately rescued by Otto Skorzeny, a Nazi commando who, took him out of prison in this crazy mountain jailbreak. He took him back to Germany and then deposited him in now German-occupied northern Italy in a town called Salò. There, Mussolini set up what is called a rump state. That is the sort of remnants of a country that has mostly been occupied by a foreign power or that has mostly collapsed and fallen apart. For the remainder of World War II, Mussolini would govern Italy from the mountains in his hidden hideaway, bunker type space. There, he pretended to be a fascist dictator, but was instead just another one of Adolf Hitler's puppets. However, it was already 1943, and by 1944, it had become clear that Italy, Germany, they were going to lose this war. Mussolini, however, had nowhere to go. He denied any of the suggestions of his, friends and allies to keep a plane or a submarine nearby so that he could escape, maybe to Brazil, maybe to Argentina. This might have worked, but he didn't do it. Ultimately, he didn't try to escape until it was too late. In 1945, the Americans were coming to his territory, and he tried to hide. He hid himself, taking on the uniform of a German soldier and moving with a group of German combatants who were trying to flee back to Germany. However, he was identified, not by the Americans, but by Italian communist partisans. These Italian partisans were led by a Colonel Valero, who eventually would end up joining the Italian government as a member of parliament for the communists. Now, the partisans and the rest of the Italian army had orders not to let anybody capture Mussolini. He was to be shot on sight. This was because they didn't want the UK or the US demanding him, putting him on trial, him getting off in any type of way. No, they wanted him dead. And so on this day in history, April the 28th, 1945, Colonel Valero and his communist partisans shot Mussolini dead. He was shot alongside, a couple people who were fleeing with him, including one of his mistresses, not his wife. Mussolini and the remains of his other comrades were taken back to Milan, where he had spent the majority of his political career, actually, and hung by their feet from a plaza so that everybody could see who they were and that they were dead, and also so that they could assault their remains, which they did, apparently, for several hours. And thus ended the life of Benito Mussolini, a former socialist who became a radical right-wing demagogue, a dictator, somebody who established a political ideology that tried to take over the world before, that is responsible for some of the most heinous crimes in the history of the world, and that is, unfortunately, making a resurgence today. But for now, I'd like you to join me in celebrating his death. Benito Mussolini, we will see you in hell.